Hello everyone, it's Ashraf Hassanpour from Shiraz University of Medical Sciences and welcome to our lecture on the visual and auditory pathways. Let me first give you an overview of the main visual pathway. The eyes act as the initial point of contact through which photons pass to access the visual pathway. The visual pathway refers to the anatomical structures responsible for the conversion of light energy into electrical action potentials that can be interpreted by the brain. While it may be tempting to believe that the visual pathway begins at the cornea, where light first makes contact with the eye, the actual pathway begins at the retina and terminates at the primary visual cortex with several intercortical tracts. So, the visual pathway begins with the light entering the ocular bulb and being processed by the retina. Information is then passed on from the retina by the optic nerve, which travels to the optic chiasm. From the optic chiasm, the axons are now called the optic tract. The axons then synapse at the lateral geniculate nucleus. Axons from the lateral geniculate nucleus travel via the optic radiation to finally reach the visual cortex. In this image, these colored areas in front of the ocular bulbs can be referred to as the visual field. The red part can be considered the left visual field and the blue part the right visual field. The retina can also be divided into two, with the lateral part closest to the temples called the temporal retina and the medial part closest to the nose called the nasal retina. So now let's have a look at which side of the visual field will travel to which part of the retina. Let us start with the left eye. Light from the left visual field will travel to the nasal retina, and light from the right visual field will travel to the temporal retina. Now looking at the right eye, we can see that light from the left visual field travels to the temporal retina, and light from the right visual field travels to the nasal retina. As we can see, axons which carry information from the left visual field have been color-coded red, and axons from the right visual field have been color-coded blue, so that we can follow their pathway. The axons that project from the retina travel within the optic nerve, and then the optic nerve travels posteromedially towards the optic chiasm. The optic chiasm is the place where part of the optic nerves cross. As you can see here, the optic nerve axons from the nasal retina cross over the other side so that all the information from the left visual field is now on the right side of the brain, and all the information from the right visual field is now on the left side of the brain. After some of the axons cross the optic chiasm, the uncrossed and crossed fibers continue as the optic tract. Each optic tract conveys information from the contralateral visual field. If we look at this image of the inferior view of brain, we can see the retinal axons which have now traveled within the optic nerve, the optic chiasm, and the optic tract synapse at the lateral geniculate nucleus. It's important to note that only 90% of the retinal axons synapse directly at the lateral geniculate nucleus. The other 10% project to the other subcortical nuclei, mainly the superior colliculus. We will have a look at the superior colliculus later on, but first let's look at the main pathway in more detail. So once the retinal axons have synapse with the lateral geniculate nuclei axons, the lateral geniculate nuclei axons project to the primary visual cortex via the optic radiation. The primary visual cortex is located within the medial part of the occipital lobe of the brain and is also known as Brodmann Area 17. Like we mentioned earlier, the left primary visual cortex processes information from the right visual field, whereas the right primary visual cortex processes information from the left visual field. We can also see this by the color coding in this image, with the left visual field and right primary visual cortex being blue and yellow, and the right visual field and the left primary visual cortex being red and green. Now let's move on to look at the superior colliculus. As I mentioned earlier, only 90% of the retinal axons synapse directly with the lateral geniculate nuclei axons. Most of the other retinal axons project to the superior colliculus and pretectal nuclei instead. The two superior colliculi sit inferior to the thalamus and they are also part of the midbrain. The function of the superior colliculus is to assist in controlling eye movements. So the axons that extend to the superior colliculi of the midbrain coordinate the reflexive movements of the extensing eye muscles, whereas those that extend to the pretectal nuclei of the midbrain function as the control centers in both the pupillary reflex to regulate the amount of the light that enters the eye and the accommodation reflex for focusing the lens. Now that we've had a look at the optic nerve and other structures involved in visual pathway, we can go over some clinical notes relevant to these structures. Inflammation of the optic nerve is referred to as optic neuritis. Optic neuritis can cause blurry vision, a partial or complete loss of vision, and pain when moving the eye. In children, there is usually bilateral involvement, whereas in adults, usually only one eye is affected. The most common etiology of optic neuritis is multiple sclerosis or MS. It can also be caused by infection, autoimmune diseases, and certain medications. Optic nerve lesions usually cause permanent and potentially severe vision loss as well as an abnormal pupillary reflex. Damage to the optic nerve can be caused by a stroke, trauma, infection, and surgical complications. The part of the visual field that is lost depends on what part of the optic nerve has been damaged. If the optic nerve is damaged before the optic chiasm, vision is lost from the eye on the same side of the lesion as none of the fibers have crossed over yet. However, if the optic nerve is damaged after the optic chiasm, visual field loss occurs on the opposite side of the lesion. For example, if the right optic nerve is damaged after the chiasm, the left visual field will be lost in both eyes. The blue fibers, which represents the left visual field on both eyes, are being prevented from being transmitted to the right side of the brain. So, it's important to remember that vision is lost in the opposite visual field and not the opposite eye. This specific loss of vision is called homonymous hemianopsia. Damage at the optic chiasm typically causes visual loss laterally on each visual field. As we can see, these blue fibers here, which represent the left visual field of the left eye, are prevented from being transmitted. The red fibers here, which represent the right visual field of the right eye, are also prevented from being transmitted. This specific type of visual loss is called bitemporal hemianopsia. Bitemporal hemianopsia can also be caused by pituitary adenoma and will compress on the optic chiasm due to its close proximity. So that concludes our lecture on the visual pathway. I hope you enjoyed it. Now let's talk about the auditory pathway. This is auditory pathway. Hair cell stimulation activates sensory neurons whose cell bodies are in the adjacent spiral ganglion. Their afferent fibers form the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. The anatomical organization of the auditory pathway has some unique features, in that this pathway involves 4 neurons, several nuclei within various regions of the brainstem, and considerable branching and interconnections between brainstem nuclei. First order neurons of the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve exit the spiral ganglion and enter the medulla oblongata, where they will synapse in the cochlear nuclei on the same side of the brain. Second order neurons will divide before exiting the cochlear nuclei. Some of the neurons cross to the opposite side of the brain and ascend to the contralateral inferior colliculus of the midbrain, while a smaller number remain ipsilateral and enter the inferior colliculus on the same side of the brain. The inferior colliculus coordinates a number of responses to acoustic stimuli, including auditory reflexes involving skeletal muscles of the head, face, and trunk. These reflexes automatically change the position of the head in response to a sudden loud noise. Other collateral fibers exiting the cochlear nuclei will synapse in the superior olivary nucleus within the brainstem. The superior olivary nucleus is involved in localizing the source of a sound. Before reaching the cerebral cortex and our conscious awareness, ascending third-order fibers from the inferior colliculi will synapse in the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. And finally, fourth-order neurons then exit the medial geniculate nucleus and deliver the information to the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe. In effect, the auditory cortex contains a map of the organ of Corti. High-frequency sounds activate one portion of the cortex, and low-frequency sounds affect another. If the auditory cortex is damaged, the individual will respond to sounds and have normal acoustic reflexes, but sound interpretation and pattern recognition will be difficult or impossible. Damage to the adjacent association area does not affect the ability to detect the tones and patterns, but produces an inability to comprehend their meaning. Okay, that brings us to the end of our lecture. Thanks for watching and happy studying.